Hey guys, my name is Miss Weekly from Allentown Elementary. Thank you so much for joining me today. We are going to have some fun with 4th grade math today. If you were tuning in on Monday, you know that we learned about equivalent fractions with tenths and hundredths. So we're going to use what we learned on Monday and we're going to take it a step further today, and we are going to use that to actually find equivalent fractions and decimals. So our essential concept for today is to use decimal notation for fractions with denominators of 10 or 100. So let's do a little review of what we did on Monday. Let's look at our hundreds grid over here. What would be one fraction that you notice that's displayed on my hundreds grid? Well, we could say 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. All right, so that would look like 70 hundreds. But can we find an equivalent fraction to that? If you're watching with somebody, tell them what an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 10 would be. Did you get 7 tenths? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tenths. We know that 70 hundredths, 70 of these little hundred tiles are the same as a tenth, which is 7 rows of 10 hundredths. So 70 hundredths and 7 tenths are equivalent. So now let's talk about what a decimal is. So a decimal is a number that contains or has a decimal point. Kind of looks like a period. But that decimal point separates the whole number from the fractional place value, like your tenths and your hundredths, and so on. Oh. All right, so we know what a decimal is. Let's talk about that decimal point for a moment. It's used in a decimal and it separates our whole number from our part of a whole, our fraction. All right, so let's look at our tens chart over here, our tens model, sorry. So we know that this displays 1/10, right? Well, if I wanted to write that in decimal form, I would write 0.1. Do you know what that 0 means? Well, that's our whole number. Do we have any holes over here? No. So since we don't have any holes, we put a 0 in our whole number place. Then we have that decimal point. Remember, that's what separates our wholes from our fraction or our fractional parts. So, and then we know that we have 1/10. All right, shaded. So our decimal notation would be 0.1 is what it looks like, but it sounds like 1/10. So it sounds the same as how we would call out our fraction 1/10, but it looks like the decimal formation, 0.1. All right, so let's look at the fraction for this one. What fraction do you see over here? Well, let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What would our denominator be? 10. Very good. So we would have 5/10. Now, what would be our equivalent fraction with a denominator of 100? If we have 5/10, how many hundredths would that be? 5 hundredths. 50 hundredths. I'm sorry, Miss Weekly's getting tongue twisted today. 50 hundredths. And I know that because I know that 1/10 is the same as 10 hundredths. So I could say 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 50 hundredths. Now, how could I write that as a decimal? Do you remember? Well, how many whole numbers do we have? 0, right? So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to put a 0. All right. Well, how many tenths do I have? 5. So this place after my decimal point is the tenths place. So since I have 5 tenths, I'm going to put a 5 in the tenths place. So my decimal notation would look like 0.5, but it sounds like 5 tenths, just like my fraction 5 tenths sounds like. All right, what fraction do you see here? 8 tenths. Very good. All right. How many hundredths do you see? 80 hundredths. Very good. All right. Now, let's talk about our decimal. Do we have any holes? Nope. So we will write a 0 for our holes in our ones place. And then we have our decimal point. How many tenths do we have? 8 tenths. So I could write my decimal. 0.8 sounds like 8 tenths. Well, let's say I wanted to write 80 hundredths in decimal form. I'm going to, again, how many holes do I have? 0, right? So I'll write a 0 in my decimal point. How many hundredths do I have? 80 hundredths. So I would write 0.80. And we can look at this and we know that 8 tenths is the same amount as 80 hundredths based on what we learned on Monday, because we know that if we have 8 tenths, each tenth equals 10 hundredths. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 hundredths. And that's how it would look like in decimal form. All right. This time, write the fraction in just tenths. Can you do it? What would it look like? 3 tenths, right? What about the decimal? What would the decimal look like? Do we have any whole numbers? Nope, we put a 0 there. And it would look like 0.3, but it would sound like 3 tenths because we have 3 tenths with 0 whole numbers. All right, let's look at this one. How many tenths do we see? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 tenths. All right. Let's write that in decimal form. Can you do it? Write it on a sheet of paper. If you're listening, if you're watching with someone, tell them what the decimal would look like. Did you say 0.6? Very good. Now let's do the hundredths. All right, if we have 6 tenths, how many hundredths would we have? 60 hundredths. All right, what would that look like in decimal form? Write it down or tell your partner you're watching with. 0. I'm running out of room. That should be 0.60. So 60 hundredths. All right, let's look at this one. We have how many tenths? 4 tenths. What would our decimal look like? Do we have any whole numbers? No, so we put a 0 there. And remember, this place is the tenths place. So since I have 4 tenths, I'm going to put a 4 in the tenths place. All right, now I know that 4 tenths is the same as 40 hundredths. And so for my decimal, I would write 0.40. This would be my 4 tenths, 4 in the tenths place, and this next spot is actually my hundredths place. All right, so let's look at these grids over here. What fraction do you see? Do we have a hole shaded? We sure do, so that means we have 1 hole. All right, what fraction is shaded in this grid? 2 tenths or 20 hundredths. So my mixed fraction would be 1 and 20 hundredths. Remember, a mixed fraction is when you have a whole number and a part of a fraction, or a part of a number. So we have 1 and 20 hundredths. So can we write that in decimal form? Let's see. Well, we've been writing a 0 in this first place before the dot, but we haven't had any whole numbers. Now that we have one whole, we write a 1 there. So we have 1 whole. And then this place is our tenths. We have 2 tenths. All right, so we write a 2 in the tenths place, or 20 hundredths. So we could actually write our decimal like this or like this, because we know that 20 hundredths is the same as 2 tenths. So you could write your decimal like this or this, and it would be the same amount, because we know that 20 hundredths is equal or equivalent to 2 tenths. All right, so let's look at this one. How many wholes do we have? 1 whole. All right, what's our fraction in this grid? 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So I have 1 and 50 hundredths. So my decimal would be 1 and 50 hundredths. Remember, I have a 1 in my whole number in my ones place before the decimal. Any number before the decimal are our whole numbers. If it's after, to the right of the decimal, it's going to be our fractional part. So we have 50 hundredths. All right, can you remember another way we could write that decimal? Write it down or tell your partner. We could write it like 1 and 5 tenths. And we can do that because we know that these 50 hundredths are the same as if we had 5 tenths. It's the same value. All right, let's look at this one. We have 1 whole and we have 70 hundredths. All right, so now for my decimal, I would write 1, my decimal point, and that's 1 whole, and 70 hundredths, or 1 and 7 tenths. And remember, my fraction that would match this would look like this, 1 and 7 tenths. But we know that both of these have the same value, the same amount. So let's look at this one. How many wholes do you see? 1, 2, 3 wholes. Very good. All right, what fraction do you see? 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100ths. So my fraction would look like this. And do you know what the decimal would look like? Tell your partner, write it down. We have a 3 because we have 3 wholes, our decimal point, and 90 hundredths. All right. We could also write our fraction like 3 because we have 3 wholes. And how many tenths do you see in these 90 hundredths? 9 tenths. So you could also write it like 3 and 9 tenths. Like that. Very good, guys. All right. And remember on Monday when we talked about how we could also use money when we're thinking about tenths and hundredths? We can do that with decimals as well. If you have 4 tenths, how many dimes would that be? 40 cents, right? If you had 4 dimes, you would have 40 cents. So we could write that as 0.40, and we could write our cent sign, but this is not money, this is just a fraction, but you can use your knowledge, that prior knowledge of what you know about money, to help you with your decimals. So I know that if I have 4/10, I can visualize 4/10 on a hundreds grid. And that would also, in decimal form, look like 0.40 or 0.4. 0.44 tenths. All right, let's keep going. All right, so 5 9/10. How many holes do we have? 5 holes. So I'm going to write a 5 and then my decimal point. How many tenths do I have? I have 9/10. All right, so I'm going to write a 9 in this place. Right after the decimal is our tenths place. If I was thinking about money, I'm kind of thinking, my 5 holes is like $5. And my 9/10 is like 9 dimes. So I could say 5.9 or 5.90, like $5.90. All right, now let's look at our hundreds. Do I have any holes in this one? I have no whole numbers, so I'm going to put a 0. Do I have any tenths? I sure don't. Think about our hundreds chart. 3 hundredths are just 3 little hundredths tiles shaded. We don't have a whole tenth shaded. So we would put a 0 in our tenths place and a 3 in our hundredths place. So 3 hundredths would look like 0.03, but it would sound like 3 hundredths, just like our fraction does. All right, now we have 12 hundredths. I want you to visualize that hundredths grid. All right, if we have 12 hundredths, I know that that's 10 hundredths shaded, so 1 whole 10, and then 2 hundredths in the next column, right? So it would look like 0.12 because I don't have a whole number, so I put a 0 there, my decimal, and then 12 hundredths. So they sound the same, but look different. All right, let's look at this one, 2 8 hundredths. All right, so I know that I have 2 holes. So I'm going to write 2, my decimal point, 8 hundredths. How would we write that as a decimal? Go ahead and write it down or tell your partner. Do we have any tenths? No, we only have 8 hundredths. So we don't have a whole column of 10. So we would put a 0 there. And so it would look like 2.08. Well, let's think about our pennies. All right, remember our hundredths are like our pennies because our pennies equal 1 cent. And we know it takes 100 pennies to make $1, just like it takes 100 hundredths to make a whole. So if we have 8 pennies or 8 cents, and 2 whole dollars, it would look like $2.08, right? So you could use what you know about money to help you with your writing your decimals from fractions as well. All right, let's look at our 64 hundredths. All right, do we have any holes? Nope. Let's think about having 64 cents. How many dimes would you have if you had 64 cents? Well, you could have 6 dimes, right? 60 cents, and then 4 pennies. So it would look like 0.64. If we were talking about money, 64 cents. If we were talking about hundredths, it would be 64 hundredths. All right, guys. So I have a few activities for you to practice what we've learned about fractions today. So our first activity is you can get your piggy banks, all right, and dump out that money. and make different money amounts. Let's say you make 84 cents. Well, I want you to write that as decimal form, like 0.84, and it sounds like 84 hundredths. You could, and then I want you to write the fraction for that, 84 hundredths. And we know those are equal amounts. All right, and you could do this with a partner. Your partner could choose a money amount. You could pick a money amount, and then you guys can add them together. Another way we could practice our fractions and decimals is playing a hopscotch game. You could go outside, or you could make a little hopscotch board on a sheet of paper and roll your dice. On your hopscotch board, all you need to do is you could write all kinds of different fractions with tenths or hundredths. Like I could have 6/10 for one, 8/10 for another, 14 hundredths for one, 56 hundredths for another. And I would want to complete my entire hopscotch board, and then each number that you land on, I want you to call out that decimal. So if you land on 4/10, then you would say, oh, my decimal would look like 0.4. So you could do this with several people. These are just some fun ways to practice our fractions and decimals. I hope you had fun today. And I will see you Monday. Have a great day, guys.